wasn't just retaliation, it was re-engineering, a fundamental shift in the rules of global trade that caught the US flat-footed and the rest of the world watching closely. Because this time, Canada didn't just say no, it said, earn your way back in. What followed over the next 24 hours would shake the foundations of North American commerce and possibly ignite a global movement. Welcome to Dollar Under Fire. Let's break down how Canada flipped the trade war script and what it means for the future of global power. It began with a podium, a smirk, and a headline that would dominate every economic outlet within minutes. On June 4, 2025, Donald Trump invoked Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, a Cold War-era legal tool designed to protect the United States from national security threats. But this time, the threat wasn't China or Russia. It was Canada and the European Union and Mexico, America's allies. Standing before reporters, Trump announced that all steel and aluminum tariffs would be doubled to 50%. His justification? Protecting national security and critical supply chains. But to many, it felt more like a political weapon disguised as patriotism. Because buried in the fine print was a hard truth. Over 40% of America's steel imports come from those very allies. The announcement sent shockwaves through global markets. But what it really did was light a fuse, one that Canada would quietly ignite weeks later. Trump believed his move would force concessions. Instead, it created enemies out of trade partners and shattered decades of trust built under NAFTA and USMCA. The strategy was bold. But it came with a blind spot. The US had long taken its dominance in North American trade for granted, assuming no ally would dare strike back with equal force. Trump's team expected pushback, maybe lawsuits or WTO complaints. What they got was silence. No official response. No fiery speech. Just patience. But behind closed doors in Ottawa, plans were being drawn, not for retaliation in kind, but for something more strategic, something surgical. Because while the US had chosen steel as its weapon, Canada was preparing to strike at something far more critical: America's access to Canada's industrial future. And what came next? No one in Washington was ready for it. On July 8, 2025, just 34 days after Trump's tariff bombshell, Canada responded. But it didn't look like a response at all. There were no fiery headlines, no retaliatory press conferences, just a sealed-door cabinet session in Ottawa and a 4-sentence memo. But those 4 sentences hit harder than any tariff. Effective immediately, Canada blocked all US-based companies from bidding on federal contracts, unless they operated with at least 50% of their manufacturing footprint inside Canada or one of its formal FTA partners. That single move shut the door on billions in American business overnight. By noon, the fallout was already visible. A Calgary light rail project lost its American electrical supplier. Hydro-Quebec canceled a multi-million-dollar turbine deal with an Oklahoma firm, mid-invoice. Toronto's Joe Rail cited supplier integrity protocol changes as it delayed construction timelines. And then came Boeing. At precisely 9:12 a.m. Eastern, a $2.4 billion airframe contract was canceled. Boeing's stock plunged 5.1% within the first hour of trading. Investors panicked. U.S. media scrambled for answers, but Canadian officials remained silent. Meanwhile, the Canadian dollar surged 1.3%. The S&P TSX Industrials Index shot up 2.1%. Confidence was booming, at least in Canada. Trump, briefed before sunrise, was livid. According to a leaked White House memo, he slammed the table hard enough to spill his America First mug. But his fury wasn't just about the money. It was about the method. The US had expected angry tweets, legal filings, or perhaps a symbolic tariff. What it got instead was surgical economic warfare. No noise, no escalation. Just quiet elimination from the procurement table. This wasn't Canada throwing punches. This was Canada changing the rules of the ring, and America had no idea what round it was in. By the time the markets had stabilized, one thing was clear. This wasn't just retaliation. It was a rewrite. Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped before cameras on the evening of July 8th, looking calm, composed, and absolutely unapologetic. He wasn't there to explain the move. He was there to unveil a doctrine. It was called the Reciprocal Access Framework. But it wasn't just policy. It was a message to the world. If you want access to our market, bring your factories with you. The rules were simple, but ruthless. Any foreign firm, especially US-based, would now have to prove that at least 50% of its manufacturing, sourcing, and labor occurred within Canada or one of its trusted trade allies. If not, they were locked out of public contracts. No loopholes, no special deals, not even for the US defense sector. It was the cleanest, most precise way to fight a trade war without ever using the word war. And the most brutal twist? Canada didn't invent this idea. America did. Carney's doctrine mirrored Executive Order 13881, a Trump-era policy demanding maximum use of American-made steel and iron in U.S. procurement. Canada had simply copied that playbook and weaponized it. Even more cleverly, Carney's government invoked the same legal justification Trump used, Section 232, citing national security and infrastructure resilience. The logic was airtight. If America could declare Canadian steel a threat, then Canada could declare U.S. suppliers unreliable. This wasn't protectionism, Carney said. It was conditional access. And legally, it held up. Washington's trade experts were stunned. Not only had Canada avoided triggering WTO violations, it had done so using American logic and American language. It wasn't a counterpunch. It was a quiet checkmate. Canada's memo didn't just shut doors. It opened new ones, and what happened next revealed the true genius behind Carney's plan. Alongside the exclusion policy, Ottawa unveiled an aggressive incentive package, an $11.2 billion co-financing pool designed to attract foreign manufacturers if they were willing to shift operations into Canada. It was the carrot to accompany the stick. And it worked instantly. Within 48 hours, South Korea's steel giant POSCO signed a memorandum of understanding to relocate its cold-rolled processing to Ontario. German multinational Siemens began exploring a power tech facility in Manitoba. Bosch, already operating in Kitchener, finalized a $64 million component deal just days later. Even Japanese and Finnish manufacturers started fast-tracking compliance plans to get a piece of Canada's industrial future. Japanese firm Komatsu launched talks to shift a portion of their parts assembly to the West Coast. Finland's Udaku, a stainless steel supplier, commissioned a feasibility study in Nova Scotia. This wasn't revenge. It was a realignment. Carney wasn't just blocking America. He was inviting the rest of the world to come build in Canada. The message was loud and clear. If the U.S. wants to wall itself off, fine. Canada would become the open alternative, but only for those willing to show up and invest on Canadian soil. This was more than just economic retaliation. It was strategic reindustrialization. And for global firms nervous about American volatility, Canada suddenly looked like a safer, smarter, more cooperative bet. The biggest winners? Companies already inside Canada, GE, GM, and Ford, whose local plants met the new criteria. They remained eligible, but smaller U.S. suppliers with no Canadian footprint? They were finished. Canada didn't just punish the U.S., it redistributed the future, and others were lining up to collect. Back in Washington, the mood had shifted from outrage to confusion. Trump's advisors had counted on allies to fall in line, especially Mexico. The assumption? That North America would present a united front against Canada's sudden aggression. But Mexico had other plans. President Claudia Sheinbaum issued a carefully worded statement that stunned U.S. officials. Mexico respects Canada's right to defend its economic sovereignty and will pursue a parallel industrial strategy. Translation? Mexico wasn't taking sides, but it definitely wasn't backing Trump. Then came Europe. Instead of condemning Canada, the European Union accelerated talks on its 2030 Green Steel Accord, extending an invitation to Canada for joint ventures. Behind closed doors, Brussels saw an opportunity. America had picked a fight. Canada had picked up partners. Even Finland got involved. The Nordic nation's steel supplier, Udaku, began studying potential production in Nova Scotia. For them, it wasn't about loyalty, it was about advantage, and Canada was offering one. As global partners moved closer to Canada, the World Trade Organization should have stepped in. The U.S. filed a complaint, claiming unjustified market discrimination. But Canada fired back with a masterstroke. It cited the same Section 232 National Security Clause that the U.S. had used to impose its own tariffs. With both sides using the same legal playbook, the WTO tribunal stalled. It kicked the case into a 14-month procedural review, demanding clarity on national security exceptions in procurement law. That delay was all Ottawa needed. Time was now on Canada's side. The U.S. thought it could act without consequence, but it never expected to find itself isolated, legally outmaneuvered, and diplomatically cornered by the very playbook it had authored. This wasn't a counterattack. It was a global pivot, and America had been left behind. While Canada gained allies and momentum, America was bleeding. Quietly, but unmistakably. The first shockwaves hit the industrial heartland. In Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania, phones started ringing at procurement offices. Projects stalled, orders vanished. Contracts once thought secure were suddenly under review. The American Iron and Steel Institute reported a staggering 9.3% week-over-week drop in cross-border orders. It wasn't just numbers. It was jobs, livelihoods, and political pressure boiling over. Oshkosh Defense, one of the U.S. military's key suppliers, warned of potential layoffs tied to a frozen deal in British Columbia. Meanwhile, Steel Dynamics halted expansion plans in Indiana, citing North American procurement instability. A corporate phrase that masked real economic fear. Even the firms that met Canada's new requirements weren't breathing easy. Ford, for instance, had enough Canadian operations to remain eligible for contracts, but its Michigan-based suppliers didn't. That meant their entire supply chain risked disqualification unless every single node localized. It wasn't just about losing contracts. It was about uncertainty, about a chilling message from north of the border. You're no longer the default supplier. You have to earn your way back in. Republican governors were furious. From Wisconsin to Pennsylvania, they demanded answers, what they called retaliatory clarity. But the Trump administration had none. It had fired the first shot, but had no plan for the aftermath. Trump remained committed to his tariff hike. But without exemptions, without strategy, the U.S. had boxed itself into a corner. And now, the corner was collapsing in. There was no WTO rescue, no ally rush, no quiet backdoor deals, just rising political pressure and falling contracts. Canada hadn't just hit America where it hurt. It had exposed how fragile the system really was. By now, the U.S. was demanding answers, but Canada wasn't flinching. It was redefining the battlefield. On July 8th, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before the press, flanked by his economic advisors. He didn't apologize. He didn't blink. Instead, he delivered a statement that would echo through trade ministries around the world. We are not closing our markets. We are conditioning access to them. That single sentence reframed the entire conflict. Canada wasn't pulling back. It was raising the bar. If you wanted in, you had to be present, visible, committed. This wasn't about nationalism. It was about control. Rather than retaliate with tariffs, like every other trade fight in history, Canada sidestepped the traps. Tariffs invite lawsuits. Tariffs spark escalation. Tariffs draw WTO fire. But procurement exclusion? That's just saying, we prefer partners who show up. It was strategic brilliance, and it came with backup. Legal scholars confirmed Canada had not violated any formal WTO rule because the policy didn't target the U.S. directly. It simply outlined standards, and if those standards happened to disqualify U.S. suppliers, that was a byproduct, not the point. The Financial Times dubbed it economic aikido, using the force of your opponent against them without ever throwing a punch. But not everyone inside Canada was cheering. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce warned that cutting out legacy U.S. suppliers could create downstream shocks, especially in sectors like rail, energy, and construction.